We welcome you to the Glass Academy webinar 2022-2023. The theme for this year is Ideas in Architecture, I for Innovation, D for Design Thinking, E for Emerging Trends, A for Around the World, and S for Sustainability. Today we have with us Dr. Shubhi Sonal. Dr. Shubhi Sonal is an urban planner, architect with an experience over 15 years in academics and practice. She holds a BArch degree from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and Masters in City Planning from IIT Kharagpur. She was awarded a PhD in Urban Planning by SPA Hyderabad, JNA FA University, based on her research work on framework for quality-oriented densification in urban Indian neighborhoods. She also holds a certification in qualitative research methods from the University of Amsterdam. Shubhi teaches as Associate Professor at School of Architecture, Rewa University, Bangalore. She has actively contributed towards designing a dynamic new curriculum and introducing new courses for undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture. She has published articles and book chapters in several reputed publications and has presented her research work at many international forums and conferences. Shubhi was awarded with Best Researcher Award in 2019 from Rewa University, Bangalore. She has also been a recipient of Best Teacher Award in year 2017 from Rewa University, Bangalore. She was awarded with conference, bursary and travel grants from Asian Research Institute, National University of Singapore in 2015 and 2021. She has delivered several expert talks for faculty members and researchers from the field of architecture and urban planning at national and international platforms. Her research interests include urban quality of life studies, cultural studies, and theories in contemporary architecture. In her free time, Shubhi enjoys reading, traveling, and expanding her understanding in the urban realms. So, with this brief, let's get over to Dr. Shubhi to enlighten us with public realms on international platforms.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I really appreciate this opportunity from the Glass Academy, whereby you all are reaching out to a very wide audience on a variety of topics. So today, the topic on which I will be talking is public spaces around the world, as it goes with the theme that you all have in mind for the year 2022-23. And without further ado, let's just get started with the presentation itself. I'll be sharing my screen. Let me know when you're able to see it. Yeah, is my screen visible?
It's visible.
Okay, so can I get started then?
Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the topic that I'll be talking about today is public spaces around the world. Now, public spaces is a theme that I think all of us have experienced at one point or the other, not necessarily always in the professional sphere, but as individuals who negotiate cities, towns, villages on a day-to-day basis throughout our lifetime. Public space is something that definitely we all have come across at various scales. If we look at definition itself, there are a few things which stand out in the definition of public space. A public space is a social space. It is a space meant for interaction. It is a space meant for people. And another important factor is that it is supposed to be open and accessible to all, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or any other kind of socioeconomic divisions that we have in our society. And public space, the whole idea has always been from a very positive space which is created such that the community can come together and interact with each other. Now, over time, several definitions have been placed forward to define the idea of public space. However, some of the points of emphasis, whichever discipline you might look into, have remained the same. So all definitions talk about the publicness of public space. Definitions speak about the level of accessibility that is allowed to the general public, the openness, and finally the sense of community that such spaces desire to achieve. So here on the screen, you can see the various disciplines which lay a stake on the idea of public space, right from politics and philosophy to, of course, urban planning, architecture, economics, sociology, economics again, psychology, human geography. All of these claim a stake in the idea of public space, and each one comes up with their own definitions and interpretations of the concept and its manifestation in our daily lives. Let's look at some of the concepts. So, there is the democratic viewpoint by which public spaces are defined. Uh, from the democratic viewpoint, public spaces are spheres of public action which are essential for democratic citizenship. And to break it down further, these would be sites of political dialogue, public action, places where everybody who is a citizen of that space has access, and spaces where a free exchange of ideas in terms of freedom of speech and judgment can happen. There have been many, many examples of this particular aspect of public spaces. And I think one of the first examples that comes to mind are the theaters in ancient Greece. So the Nix Theatre, one of the one of the first birthplaces of democracy, as it is called, was a space where it is known as one of the first sites of democratic action and hence public engagement. And it dates back to 507 years BC, and this was established after the reforms led by Cleisthenes led to transfer of power to the citizens. More than 6,000 people could assemble here and they could debate the everyday matters of governance. The idea has continued in various forms, and much recently, a more contemporary example is what you see on the right hand side, where you see the Tahrir Square in Egypt, which became a center for political demonstrations and protests ever since the early 20th century. Very, very recently, 2011 Egyptian revolution also happened centered around this particular Tahrir Square, leading to the resignation of their president and establishment of a new regime. Moving on, there is the urban planning viewpoint of what is a public space. From an urban planning viewpoint, these are spaces which are important nodes or loci in the overall layout and spatial planning network of modern cities. An example being the Central Park in New York, which sort of anchors the whole city together and becomes a space for recreation, for personal use, as well as for community activities. On the other hand, we have the example of Victoria Harbour in Hong Kong, where the economically significant port area has now transformed into a public plaza that allows for public use. This area now has office buildings, it has museums, it has eateries, and it has the whole gamut of public activities which draw not only tourists but also people living in the dense city of Hong Kong looking for some kind of relief and relaxation on a daily basis. The architecture viewpoint is slightly more, I would say, evolved in terms of where we look at trying to create symbols of physical space that reinforce identity, power, and authority. And some of the terms that we use to define public spaces when looking at it from an architectural viewpoint would be monumentality, some sense of order, timelessness, and of course, many times identity is also brought into the picture, and we could have public spaces which sort of become the symbol of nationalism. So, historically speaking, again, we have examples of this complex relationship between identity, power, and authority. St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City. It has sort of struck the balance between the monumentality and the human scale to create a public plaza that becomes the identity of this tiny nation. On the other hand, we have the Trafalgar Square in London, which it was established in the historic setting of the Charing Cross. And the Nelson's column and the bronze lions, what you see in the picture here, were brought in much later as symbols of imperial power and the command that the nation held over its many colonies. So, in a sense, it brings together both nationalism, monumentality, the sense of identity all together through architecture in the public space. Next, we have the sociology viewpoint. Sociology is all about people and how people interact with each other. So at this juncture, a public space becomes purely, a ground for community interaction, where social networks can be built and explored, and social justice can be implemented. It becomes a common ground, often invoking a sense of nostalgia, leading to community interaction and aiming for equity. One of the very unique and celebrated examples is the Parc de la Ville, designed by Bernard Schumi in Paris, which was designed in the 1980s. Now, Paris itself is known for a variety of public spaces, open spaces, beautifully landscaped gardens. And this was a period where uh, the government was not looking for a throwback to the past. Rather, they were looking at something which would define where the future was headed. And Shumi's design is not of a picturesque landscaped garden. That's the first thing that comes to mind when one talks about a park. Rather, it is a space which allows people to engage at various levels. He established the red color structure that you see in the photograph called as folies, which stood on paths and networks, and it allowed for people to interpret each folie as they would want it to be. It was a space which sort of moved beyond the usual imagination of public space, and at the same time allowed people to engage, explore, move, and interact the way they would want to. It becomes timeless because the meanings of the space, the interpretation of the space changes from time to time, from person to person, from social group to social group, and hence, the architectural impact of it is much larger than just purely a single concept based uh, architecture. On the other hand, I have an example which is much closer home. So there is the Charminar precinct at Hyderabad, which generates a certain nostalgia in the minds of people. It is a much renowned landmark. Anybody who looks at this picture can immediately identify which building this is and what city are we talking about. At the same time, come festivals, and this whole area becomes a common ground where people come together to shop, to explore, and the kind of vibrancy that comes within this setting talks again about a community interaction space where social networks are built on a daily basis. We move on. There can be many other definitions, but I think for us, one of the most important definitions to anticipate and understand is the futurist viewpoint. Public spaces definitely are moving beyond the usual physical boundaries. We no longer have to have a design space for publicness. uh, Communities no longer necessarily engage in physical spaces. And I would say most of the interaction that is happening for the Gen Z is happening in social networks through electronic exchanges among network nodes and hubs. So, in that sense, even a small Wi Fi zone becomes a space for public interaction, though not physically, but yes, in the virtual world. On the other hand, we have new imaginations of public spaces coming up in terms of the metaverse, where these are new ways of interaction, communication, and conversations. And what it finally leads to, how does it change human behavior in terms of public and public realm, is yet to be seen. We move to the second theme of today, where I would like to introduce what is it that defines the publicness of public space. So there are several parameters which have come across through various research studies which actually define how public is a public space. So there is, of course, ownership. Ownership talks about who owns the particular piece of land or infrastructure. Most of the time, public space comes up on pieces of land or properties which are owned by the government or which are under public control. Now, there are two things here, there is ownership and there is control. Many times we see that even though there may be public spaces with public ownership, it is the level of control which each individual has which actually determines how well they are able to utilize it. A common example being public parks in the city, which though are definitely within the public realm and are under public ownership, there might be limits on the number of hours to which you can actually access that particular public space, leading to a certain pattern of usage by the people around it. On the other hand, we have the parameter of usage or functionality. Public spaces can be very, very diverse, as we have seen in all the examples in the previous slides. And definitely, it is the usage or the functionality which will define who are the stakeholders who come into the space and use it to their benefit. Civility is all about the public coming together and looking for a space for civil action. Again, barriers such as control, functionality, location, accessibility, all of these things determine what is the level of civility that is allowed by a public space. Of course, as architects and urban planners, we are very much interested in the physical design aspect of public spaces. And that is where we can start to draw in many elements and principles of design which sort of become the backbone of a good design for a public space. And of course, on the same lines, we have scale, which sort of defines how the stakeholders relate to the public space. So all of these and many more parameters together determine how public is the public space. And any public space that we look at can finally be delineated into these 6 or 7 parameters that I'm showing here on the screen. There have been many research studies which talk about categories of public space. And one of the important research studies that I would like to quote is by Cohn, who talks about how ownership, accessibility, and potential for social interaction are some of the most important aspects of public spaces. They go on to describe public spaces as 3 categories. There is positive space, there is negative space, and there is the very interesting ambiguous space. Now, positive space is a space which is usually occurring to us in form of natural or semi-natural urban space, for example, rivers, natural features, seafronts, canals, civic space such as well-designed streets, public squares, promenades which are meant for public use, and public open space which comes in terms of parks, gardens, commons, urban forests, cemeteries, etc. 2 of the examples of such spaces are given here in the photograph that you can see on the screen. On the other end of the spectrum, we have negative spaces. Negative spaces are very much in the public realm. They are accessible to the public. The public is allowed to use them. And yet, they may not have any kind of positive impact on the quality of life which is offered to the citizens. So these become movement spaces such as the main roads, motorways, railways, underpasses, service spaces, leftover spaces, and undefined spaces. These spaces, I would say, hold a lot of potential because these spaces are available to us and are as yet undeveloped. And these are the spaces that which we can rely on and convert into active public spaces or positive public spaces. Lastly, but definitely not the least, there are these ambiguous spaces where there might be contradiction in ownership, control, and usage. Spaces such as malls, retail shops, restaurants, institutions, playgrounds, these are again spaces where the general public has access from time to time. These are spaces where we go to meet our friends. There are places which we want to hang out with our family and friends and expand our social network. At the same time, the ownership may lie with private individuals and the level of control and accessibility may be limited. Again, these are spaces which hold a huge amount of potential in terms of development of public spaces in our cities. Now, coming to the third part of this presentation, where I would like to pick up 2 case studies of public spaces examples around the world. Now, when this topic was thrown at me, for a minute I was lost because there are just too many examples, good and bad both, to pick up when we speak about public spaces around the world. There are 2 examples, 2 countries which come to our mind immediately when we talk about excellent public space design. So one is South Korea, the capital Seoul, which is one of my favorite cities, and this is a city which really stands apart in the design of its public spaces. Seoul is a beautiful city. It is a city with a lot of heart and soul, as they say, and it has a gamut of large scale monumental public spaces. Most of the spaces that we see, which are in the public realm, are a result of massive infrastructural development, massive investment in regeneration and revitalization of the city. You see examples of the Bongamoon Square, which is, it falls in the category of a historic or a nostalgia related public space because it lies right in front of the very famous palace and apart from being a tourist spot, it also sort of becomes a culmination point for a lot of cultural activities, museums, and a plaza space, right? We have the Sunyodo Park, which is again a very interesting project because decommissioned water purification plant was converted into a public park with a gamut of sports activities, right? And then there are two more examples where we have the Seolo 7017, which was a public space repurposed from a former highway and overpass, and the Dongdaemun Design Plaza and Cultural Park, which was transformed from a sewing industrial zone to a design plaza and cultural center, which definitely, adds a lot of color and vibrancy to the city. Apart from these, there is one specific example that I would like to take up today. It's the Cheonggyecheon stream in Seoul, which has a beautiful romantic history behind it. The Cheonggyecheon River was sort of the lifeline of Seoul for, several centuries, and presently it has a catchment area of around 61 square kilometer. You can see the map here where the river sort of flows right through into the Seoul CBD. And there was a time in 1920s where the river was a lifeline for the people, and people would use it for their daily purposes such as bathing, cleaning, washing clothes, etc. As it happens, this led to a lot of development around the river, and it became the center of urban blight. You can see the picture on the right hand side of 1958, where slum like settlements came up next to the river. The government in 1970s decided to cover up this center of urban blight. So the idea was to completely cover up the river, which was now reduced to just a small stream. A massive highway development project was established, cutting through the CBD, and this is what you see in 1970. Time passed, and this became sort of the most busiest area of Seoul. And as it happens, most of the CBDs, such as this one specifically, it started to degenerate, and there was a need for regeneration of this area. The area was going down, people were moving out, there was too much of issues in terms of infrastructural issues and also environmental concerns because the stream somewhere was pushed beneath this massive infrastructural development. In 2003, this was the time when a new government came up and they decided to completely remove this infrastructure and sort of bring out the river back to the public again. So you see photograph of how the highway was removed. And finally, around 2005 is when the Cheonggyecheon stream was reopened to the public as a beautiful public space consisting of plazas, squares, areas for interaction, where the nature is brought back into the city again. Now, the Cheonggyecheon stream restoration is one of the most iconic projects of Seoul, and it has sort of become a hallmark in the idea of urban development where, there is sort of that complex interaction between infrastructural development and nature, environmental concerns, and of course, the creation of public space. The city has reclaimed its public space. Of course, a lot of revitalization, a lot of maintenance activity, a lot of investment has gone into it, but you can see the results on the screen here. Another example, which is right from the other end of the world, another city that I would like to talk about very briefly is Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam is known for its streets. Anybody who has visited Amsterdam knows that real Amsterdam lives on the streets. Amsterdam offers to its citizens a variety of recreation and social interaction spaces, which in itself is not unusual. Most of the cities aim to provide a lot of recreational and social interaction spaces for their citizens. However, where Amsterdam excels is that all of these activities, these public activities, happen on the street and not in designated or secluded areas. So it is the streets which become the most significant public spaces in the city, and Amsterdam makes up almost 30% of all land in the urban core with these activated streets. They have come up with various techniques of activating the streets. First of all, of course, street light flourishes when traffic is removed. So yes, there are spaces where There are absolutely no car zones. You can see people walking or riding the bicycles, which are the most, popular mode of transportation in Amsterdam. There is the interesting concept of play streets, where small play areas are created along the street such that children don't have to be scared of streets. I think this brings back to us, our situation in India, where any mother or any parent is scared of letting their children out in the street for the fear of traffic. The idea was to reclaim the streets for children, create small play spaces for them, which are not only safe spaces, but which also bring back the street into the lives of people. Then, of course, a lot of street gardens, such as the ones that you see on the image over here, which supplement the existing facade gardens, uh, which again sort of add to the overall experience of the street. So, likewise, there are many, many such examples from the city of Amsterdam where streets are reclaimed by the people and streets itself become public spaces. So, there is no need for separate squares and plazas to create public spaces. Rather, what is already public is sort of transformed in a way that the publicness of it increases. And this is the point that I've been trying to make through this presentation. Some new ideas are coming up for public spaces as we, sort of move towards further development in all the cities around the world. One has to understand that any kind of greenfield development where you're going to get lots of land and you're going to start designing spaces from scratch is probably impractical, right? So most of the cities are getting busier and busier. More and more people are moving to the cities. Land is at a premium. In that aspect, we need to look at what is already public and how do we make it more public. So there are examples of parklets, pocket parks, small pop-up public libraries, small pop-up public spaces, as you can see in the images here. And these are just starting points where the public begins to reclaim the spaces which are already in the public domain, and they begin to make them more usable and more engaging such that the overall quality of life that's being offered to the citizens of that city improves. So with these interesting examples, I think we will wrap up today's session. These are some of the references, and if anybody is interested in further reading on the topic, this is a very, very interesting and broad topic, I would say. And the aspect that I've tried to bring forward today is how the publicness itself can be looked into as a parameter for regenerating public spaces. We do not need new public spaces. We need to relook into the public aspects of the already existing public space. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shubhi, for bursting our bubbles about the concept of public spaces through your insightful presentation. I'm sure our viewers have a lot of takeaways from your presentation and must be curious to know more, including myself. So I would like to ask you a few questions. So the first question is, what can be done to enhance the urban realms in India?
Priyanka, as I think I've mentioned in my
Yeah.
presentation also, in a country like India, we have our usual issues of there's too much of population, there's very less money available for any kind of development, and there are fewer opportunities of any kind of actual new greenfield development. In the sense, you're not going to get a blank canvas to start designing spaces from scratch. So it is in the field of urban regeneration and revitalization of the already existing traditional public spaces where most of the opportunities lie. Our unique cultural ethos offers us multiple such options. So in India, we have examples of the Durga Puja pandals which come up in Kolkata, the Ganpati festival pandals which come up in Mumbai, Maharashtra, and many other cities of India. We have the Kumbh Mela, which sort of creates this whole public realm once every year. So these options are already there, and we need to look into these organic public spaces, make them better, make them more usable, work on better designs for these, rather than trying to find a format that fits into the Western models that we see. So that is probably where we can really make a difference and come up with public spaces which people can use and understand and experience better.
So the next question is, can we say that creating a good public space is an art that requires no physical building?
Well, physical buildings are just a tool, just like there are many other tools in the hands of architects and planners. It is one of the tools, it is not everything. Physical structure can be a part of the overall placemaking exercise when seen from the viewpoint of architecture. But more than the building, I think from an architect's perspective, we should be able to visualize a space which will invite all the stakeholders inside. Now, whether a physical component is required or not will change based on the context, based on the location, based on the usage, all the parameters that I have spoken about. So, this is a decision that the architect has to take whether an actual wall or a building is required or not.
Moving on to the next question. Like you mentioned in defining the public spaces, that it is open and accessible to all regardless of gender. So, how do we maintain the gender equality in public spaces, especially in India?
Gender gender equality is a much broader issue, I would say, and just public spaces cannot change anything, right? So, yeah, we have to start with change in mindset of the society where we become more accepting of the various gender identities of individuals. What can we do? Yes, we can look into universal design principles. We can make spaces more inclusive. Small interventions such as gender agnostic toilets, designs that promote surveillance and safety, or even go back to old principles such as Jane Jacobs' eye on the street principle, such that people begin to feel more safe in these public spaces. So there are a lot of these design interventions, and I think a lot of research is happening on this aspect. For those who are interested, they can really read about it. An example comes to mind where one of the surveys in a public park, people were asked, various categories of users were asked, where do you feel more comfortable? So even the placement of trees and the landscape sort of determines where would the girls group go and sit and where would the boys group go and sit, right? So it is as simple as that. Every aspect of design can come with a sensitivity towards gender, especially when we talk about building inclusive spaces, spaces where people from all sections of the society, especially the marginalized one, feel safer.
Moving on to our last questions. So, as of now, the concept of public places is not very popular in our country, while it's well focused in the West. So, what are some challenges according to you that with respect to designing these public spaces in India?
Well, I would like to slightly disagree. I think we have a lot of public spaces. It's just that, they're underutilized or they are in a state where some kind of revitalization is required. We need to identify these public spaces and make them more useful and better. Challenges, yes. I think one of our main challenges is we just have too many users. So often crowd control, capacity management, any new infrastructure that comes up, that's the first thing that we begin to struggle with, right? So carrying capacity of that particular infrastructure is something that we need to look into more deeply. Designing for the future in the sense having an outlook where we design for the next 25, 30, 50 years, if we can sort of start our calculations with that, probably space will be more useful. Other challenges remain, we have a lot of budgetary constraints, and probably in a country like India, public space design is not the top priority. We have many other social priorities which, sort of claim the attention of municipal authorities. Just providing of housing or basic road infrastructure probably would be, more important in certain cases. But at the same time, as I said, we need not start from scratch. We need to look into what we already have. Villages have their own interaction spaces. There are religious spaces such as temple and mosques in every street, which again become spaces for interaction, nodes for interaction. We have these festivals which bring in large number of people together. So public spaces already exist. Yes, they are not the same and they will never be the same as what we see in the Western world. And let us not even aspire for that because our lifestyle is not the same as this. We should also realize that in a city like India, where housing is a problem, where cities are overcrowded, people do look at spending a lot of time outside and getting a lot of relief from the public realm. So that tendency to do that is already there. We are not closeted in our homes all the time, except the past 2 years of COVID. The first idea is always to go out and be somewhere outside. So the tendency is already there. We need to build on that and make sure that the spaces that already exist, these could be spaces between the buildings, this could be the ideas of loose space, the streets that we have, these can be revitalized to bring together the idea of a very, very unique Indian concept of public space.
That was very informative and 2 points. So, on the behalf of the Class Academy and Ethos team, I'd like to thank you for sharing this insightful presentation and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. It was lovely talking to you and your team. So thank you again.
Thank you.